The howling winter winds swirled snow across the barren plains as 5 riders approached the isolated cabin. Their leader, Silas Blackwell, surveyed the meager homestead with cold calculation. One thin column of smoke rising from the chimney, no horses in the small corral, and windows dark except for a single flickering light. Easy pickings, he thought. A widow alone with young'uns in the dead of winter wouldn't put up much of a fight. What Silas and his gang didn't know was that the rifle perched beside the cabin door belonged to Mason Reed, a former cavalry scout and one of the most respected trackers in the Montana Territory. And Mason wasn't about to let anything happen to Sarah Mitchell or her twin boys, not after finding them half frozen in the snow 2 days ago, and certainly not after making her a promise that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter December cold settled over the rolling hills of Timber Creek as Sarah Mitchell placed another log on the dwindling fire. At 32, her once soft hands had grown calloused from 2 years of fighting the harsh Montana wilderness. Alone, the small cabin creaked under the weight of fresh snow, a sound that had become as familiar to her as the quiet breathing of her 6-year-old twin boys, Ethan and Noah, who slept huddled together beneath a pile of quilts in the corner. Sarah tucked an errant strand of auburn hair behind her ear and glanced at the dwindling pile of firewood. Thomas had always cut enough to last the winter before the first snow fell, but Thomas was 2 years gone now, taken by a fever that swept through the territory, leaving her with a half-built homestead, 2 young boys, and little more than her determination to keep his dream alive. "We'll need more wood by morning," she whispered to herself, rubbing her hands together near the flames. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally arrived, howling around the cabin corners like a living thing. No chance of gathering. More tonight. She moved to the window, wiping away the frost with her sleeve, to peer into the darkness. The moon, nearly full, cast an eerie glow across the snow-covered landscape, transforming the familiar hills into something alien and forbidding. In moments like these, the isolation of their homestead pressed down on her like a physical weight. The boys stirred in their sleep, and Sarah forced herself away from the window. She had to be strong for them. They were all that mattered now. The roof above her groaned under a fresh assault of snow and wind. Tomorrow she would need to clear it before the weight became too much. Another task Thomas would have handled. Another reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Moving to the crude wooden table that served as both kitchen workspace and dining area, Sarah unfolded a worn piece of paper, the last letter from her sister in St. Louis, urging her to abandon the homestead and return east. "There's nothing for you there now," Rebecca had written. "You're killing yourself and risking those boys for a piece of land that will never love you back." Perhaps Rebecca was right. The winter had come early this year, fiercer than any she'd experienced since moving west. Their food stores were adequate but not abundant, the livestock reduced to 2 milk cows and a handful of chickens after selling the rest to buy necessities in town last month. Sarah folded the letter and tucked it away. She'd made her decision. Come spring, if they survived the winter, she would sell the homestead and take the boys east. Thomas would understand. He'd never wanted them to suffer. A sudden noise outside made her freeze. Something different from the wind, a clatter near the small lean-to where she kept the tools. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she reached for the rifle Thomas had taught her to use. Wolves, maybe, drawn by the scent of the livestock in the small barn attached to the cabin. The noise came again, more distinct this time, the unmistakable sound of a horse nickering. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. No one from town would be traveling in this weather, certainly not at night. The nearest neighbor, old Hank Wilson, lived 5 miles east and rarely left his property in winter. No answer came, except the moan of the wind. Sarah checked that the door was firmly barred before moving to the window again. Through swirling snow, she caught movement, a dark figure struggling through drifts toward her door, leading a horse behind. The stranger stumbled, nearly falling, before righting himself and pressing forward. "Mama." Noah's voice, small and worried, came from the corner where the twins slept. "It's all right," she assured him, though her white-knuckled grip on the rifle suggested otherwise. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart." A heavy knock rattled the door. "Hello, the house," a man's voice called, barely audible above the storm. "I've lost my way in this blizzard. I don't mean any harm, Ma'am." Sarah hesitated, the rifle steady in her hands. Thomas had always been hospitable, never turning away a traveler in need. But Thomas wasn't here to protect them if this stranger harbored ill intentions. "I've got a loaded rifle pointed at this door," she called back. "State your business." "Name's Mason Reed," the voice returned, stronger now. "I was heading to Blackwater when the storm hit. I've been riding through it for hours trying to find shelter. My horse is about done in, and I'm not much better." Sarah peered through a crack in the window shutters. The man was tall, his broad shoulders hunched against the driving snow. A wide-brimmed hat couldn't hide the ice forming in his dark beard. Behind him, his horse stood with head hanging low, steam rising from its nostrils. The stranger would die if left out there. Even a hardened man couldn't survive a Montana blizzard without shelter. "Stand back from the door," Sarah instructed, making her decision. "Once I open it, come in slowly. Leave your sidearm outside." "Yes, ma'am," came the immediate response. She watched as he removed a holstered pistol and placed it on the porch railing, then stepped back as instructed. Sarah lifted the heavy wooden bar and cracked the door, rifle still at the ready. The bitter cold rushed in along with swirling snow. The man stood exactly where she'd told him to, hands visible at his sides. "My horse," he said, nodding toward the exhausted animal. "He won't make it through the night in this." Sarah nodded. "Stables connected to the back of the cabin. Bring him around and get him settled, then come to the front door again." Relief flashed across the stranger's weathered face. "Thank you, ma'am." Sarah closed the door and waited, listening as the man led his horse around to the small attached barn. She moved to the twins, who were now both awake and watching with wide eyes. "It's just a traveler caught in the storm," she explained softly. "Remember how Pa always said we help those in need?" Ethan, always the more cautious of the two, frowned. "What if he's a bad man?" Sarah forced a smile. "That's why we keep Pa's rifle close, but I don't think he means us harm. Sometimes good folks just need shelter from the storm." Minutes later, another knock came. Sarah opened the door to find the man standing there, snow covering his shoulders and hat. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps early 30s, with intelligent grey eyes that assessed her just as carefully as she studied him. "Thank you kindly," he said, stepping inside when she moved back to admit. "Him." His gaze immediately went to the twins, and a gentle smile softened his features. "Evening, boys." Neither child spoke, but Noah offered a small wave. "Your horse settled?" Sarah asked, closing the door against the howling wind. Mason nodded, removing his snow-covered hat. "He's grateful to be out of that storm. You're saving both our lives tonight, Mrs. Mitchell." "Sarah Mitchell." She kept the rifle loosely pointed in his direction. "And these are my sons, Ethan and Noah. Pleased to meet you all." He made no comment about the rifle, instead moving carefully toward the fire, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "That's quite a storm brewing. Going to get worse before it gets better, I reckon." "You can warm yourself by the fire and sleep on the floor tonight," Sarah told him, nodding toward a space near the hearth. "We don't have much food to spare, but I can offer you some stew." "That's more than generous." Mason looked around the small cabin, taking in the patched roof, the carefully mended curtains, and the few personal belongings. His eyes lingered on a framed daguerreotype of a young man in work clothes, standing proudly in front of a half-built cabin. "Your husband," Sarah nodded stiffly. "Thomas, he's been gone 2 years now." Something like understanding passed across Mason's face, but he asked no more questions. Instead, he removed his heavy coat and hung it near the fire to dry. "I was a cavalry scout during the war," he offered, seemingly aware that she needed to know more about the stranger in her home. "Now I do some tracking work for the territorial marshal and guide supply trains through the mountain passes. Was heading to Blackwater for a job when this storm blew in." Sarah ladled a small portion of stew into a bowl and handed it to him, finally setting the rifle aside, though still within reach. "Blackwater's a good 20 miles west of here. You're far off course." Mason nodded, accepting the bowl with thanks. "Lost my bearings when the snow started. Been following what I thought was Miller's Creek, but must have veered north without realizing." While he ate, Sarah settled the twins back into their bed. "Try to sleep," she whispered. "Everything's fine." The stranger's arrival had disrupted the quiet routine of their evening, but there was something reassuring about having another adult in the cabin. The loneliness that had been her constant companion seemed to retreat to the corners. If only, temporarily. When she returned to the fire, Mason had finished his meal and was sitting quietly, staring into the flames. "You've been out here alone since your husband passed?" he asked, his voice low so as not to disturb the children. Sarah nodded, taking a seat across from him. "Thomas had a dream of building something here, a legacy for our boys." She glanced toward the window where the storm raged on. "But I've decided to sell come spring, head back east to my sister in St. Louis." Mason's eyes met hers, and for a moment Sarah felt as though he could see right through the brave face she'd been wearing for 2 years. "It's a hard country for anyone alone," he said simply. "Yes," she agreed, looking away. "It is." The fire crackled between them as the wind continued its assault on the small cabin. For the first time in months, Sarah felt the crushing weight of her solitude ease, if only for one night, while the storm raged outside and a stranger with kind eyes shared the warmth of her fire. Neither of them could have known that by morning their lives would be irrevocably linked, or that 5 riders were already making their way through the storm, following rumors of a vulnerable homestead ripe for the taking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first grey light of dawn had barely crept across the snow-covered landscape when Mason Reed awoke. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind before the events of the previous night returned. The blinding storm, finding the isolated cabin, the wary widow with tired eyes who'd nonetheless offered him shelter. He rose silently, careful not to disturb Sarah and the twins, still sleeping across the room. The fire had burned low during the night, and the cabin's interior had grown cold. Moving with practiced quietness, Mason added several logs from the dwindling pile and stoked the flames back to life. Through the frost-covered window, he surveyed the aftermath of the storm. Snow had drifted against the cabin's north wall nearly to the eaves, and the landscape beyond was transformed into an endless sea of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of distant pines. The storm had passed, but the temperature had dropped. Further, the kind of bone-deep cold that made even breathing painful. Mason checked his pocket watch, just past 6. He'd intended to depart at first light, to make up for lost time on his journey to Blackwater, but something held him back. The vulnerability of this small family in such harsh conditions gnawed at him. The firewood wouldn't last more than another day, 2 at most, and from what he'd observed, the widow Mitchell was running perilously low on other supplies as well. A soft cough turned his attention to the corner where the twins were stirring, matching faces peering at him from beneath a pile of quilts with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "Morning, boys," Mason said softly, tipping his head in greeting. Noah, the more outgoing of the pair that Mason had quickly distinguished by a small scar near his eyebrow, offered a tentative smile. "Is it still snowing, mister?" "Storms passed, but it left behind more than enough to keep us busy," Mason replied, crouching down to their level. "You two sleep well?" Ethan, his expression more guarded than his brother's, nodded slightly. "Are you leaving now?" The question carried an undercurrent that Mason couldn't quite decipher. Relief, perhaps, at the stranger's departure, or maybe concern for what would happen once he was gone. Before he could answer, Sarah stirred and sat up quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped nearby. "It's just me, Mrs. Mitchell," Mason assured her, straightening to his full height. "Boys and I were just getting acquainted." Sarah relaxed marginally, brushing her hair from her face as she rose. "What time is it?" "Just after 6. Storm's moved on, but it's left quite a mess behind." She moved to the window, peering out at the transformed landscape. And Mason saw the moment when concern tightened her features. The severity of their situation was clear in the set of her shoulders. "That drift is nearly to the roof on the north side," she observed quietly, "and the stable entrance is completely blocked." "I'll dig out the animals after breakfast," Mason offered, "then clear a path to the woodpile. Speaking of which," he gestured to the diminished stack by the hearth, "you're running low." Sarah met his gaze directly. "We have enough." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, but Mason had spent too many winters in Montana territory to be fooled. "With respect, ma'am, not for long. Not in this cold." A tense silence stretched between them before Noah piped up from the corner. "Ma makes the best cornbread in the territory. Pa always said so." The mention of Thomas Mitchell eased the tension, bringing a soft smile to Sarah's face. "Your father was biased," she told her son fondly, then turned to Mason. "But we do have enough cornmeal for breakfast, if you'd care to judge for yourself." Mason recognized the offer as both hospitality and a shift in her demeanor, a cautious extension of trust. "I'd be honored." While Sarah prepared a simple breakfast, Mason took stock of the cabin's construction with a practiced eye. Thomas Mitchell had clearly been skilled with his hands. The logs were well fitted, the chinking well maintained where Sarah could reach. Though he noticed several spots near the roof where winter winds had worked the mixture loose. The attached stable was a clever design, allowing access to the animals without exposing oneself to the elements, a critical feature during Montana winters. But there were unfinished elements as well, the half-completed storage shed visible through the window, a partially constructed addition to the main cabin, projects interrupted by death, leaving a widow to maintain what was completed rather than fulfilling the original vision. "Your husband was a fine builder," Mason commented, as Sarah placed a cast-iron skillet of cornbread on the table. "He had plans," she replied, her voice soft with memory. "Always plans." She gestured for the twins to wash up. This was going to be one of the finest homesteads in Timber Creek, according to Thomas. "I can see it would have been," Mason agreed. "The foundation is solid." Something passed across Sarah's face, perhaps recognition that he wasn't merely offering platitudes, but had genuinely assessed her husband's work and found it worthy of respect. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the twins gradually warming to Mason's presence. They peppered him with questions about his work as a tracker, his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Scout, and the most dangerous animal he'd ever encountered. "A mother grizzly with cubs," he told them seriously. "Smarter than any outlaw and twice as determined. Best to give them a wide berth." When the meal was finished, Mason rose and reached for his coat. "I'll start clearing a path to the stable. Your livestock will need tending." Sarah nodded, though concern shadowed her features. Shovels by the door, but Mr. Reed, Mason, please. Mason, she amended, you don't owe us anything. The storm has passed. I'm sure you're anxious to continue your journey. Mason considered his response carefully. Ma'am, there's nearly 4 feet of fresh snow out there, temperatures well below, freezing, and no sign of warming for days, according to the sky I'm reading. Now, I could ride out or try to, but I suspect I wouldn't make it far in these conditions. And leaving you and the boys to manage alone, he shook his head. I couldn't do that with a clear conscience. Sarah straightened, that same pride returning to her posture. We've managed before, no doubt. But right now, an extra pair of hands would make a difference. Let me help today, at least until we get things in order. Then I'll be on my way if that's what you prefer. Their eyes met in silent evaluation, and Mason waited patiently for her decision. Finally, Sarah nodded once. Until this evening, then. The bitter cold hit Mason like a physical blow when he stepped outside. The sky stretched endlessly blue above, sun glinting off the snow with blinding brightness, but there was no warmth. In the light, Mason worked methodically, clearing a path to the stable first. Inside, he found 2 thin milk cows and a small flock of chickens, all appearing underfed but alive. He tended the animals, noting the carefully rationed feed, then began the arduous task of clearing the north side of the cabin where snow had drifted, alarmingly high. The work was exhausting in the frigid air, but Mason found a rhythm, his thoughts turning to the small family inside. Sarah Mitchell was clearly a woman of remarkable fortitude, maintaining the homestead alone while raising 2 young boys. But determination alone couldn't overcome the brutal realities of winter in Montana Territory. Without sufficient supplies, without enough firewood, without the strength to clear paths through snowdrifts that would only grow deeper as winter progressed. Mason had seen too many similar situations end in tragedy. By midday, he'd cleared critical areas around the cabin and stable and turned his attention to the woodpile. Sarah had been right. They did have wood, but not nearly enough. The covered stack would last perhaps 3 more days in this cold. After that, Mason was contemplating this problem when he noticed movement on the distant ridge to the west. Shielding his eyes against the sun's glare, he focused on the dark shapes moving along the tree line. Riders, 5 of them, moving deliberately through the deep snow, following what appeared to be the remnants of a trail that would eventually lead to the Mitchell homestead. In his years as a scout, Mason had developed an instinct for trouble. Something about the riders' formation, their steady pace despite difficult conditions, triggered his wariness. Ordinary travelers would be hurrying toward shelter, not methodically surveying the landscape as these men appeared to be. He returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots before entering. Sarah looked up from where she was mending a shirt, her expression questioning. "We may have company coming," Mason said without preamble. 5 riders approaching from the west ridge. The color drained from Sarah's face. Neighbors, perhaps? The Wilsons might have sent help when they saw the smoke. Mason shook his head. "The Wilsons are east of here," you said. "These men are coming from the west, and they're moving too deliberately for my liking." Sarah set her mending aside and moved to where the twins were playing quietly with carved wooden animals. "Boys, I need you to gather your things and prepare for a game of hide and seek. Remember the special hiding place Pa showed you?" The twins exchanged a look before nodding solemnly. This was clearly not the first time they'd been instructed to hide. "What is it?" Mason asked quietly when the boys were occupied. "Who might those riders be?" Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the rifle. "There have been rumors, stories of men targeting isolated homesteads during winter when help is far away and law even farther. Silas Blackwell and his gang. They've been moving through the territory, taking what they want and leaving little behind." Mason Reed's expression hardened at the mention of Silas Blackwell. He'd heard the name during his travels, a former Confederate. officer turned outlaw who'd gathered a crew of desperate men with no compunctions about violence. They preyed on the vulnerable, particularly in winter when law enforcement couldn't easily reach remote homesteads. "How many rounds do you have for that rifle?" he asked, moving to the window to gauge the rider's progress. "Half a box," Sarah replied, checking the weapon with practiced hands. 20 rounds, maybe less. Mason nodded, his mind already calculating angles, positions, vulnerabilities. The cabin's construction provided decent defensive possibilities, but 5 armed men against the 2 of them presented steep odds. "The boys," he said, watching as Ethan and Noah disappeared through a small concealed door built into the pantry. Wall. "Will they be safe where they're hiding?" Thomas built a space between the inner and outer walls, Sarah explained, her voice low. "Insulated, with access to a crawl space that leads to the stable if necessary. He was always concerned about Indian raids when we first settled here." "Smart man," Mason acknowledged. He checked his own revolver, a well-maintained Colt he'd retrieved from the porch railing that morning. "I've got 12 rounds, plus what's in my saddlebags." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to involve yourself in this, Mr. Reed." "This isn't your fight." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, it became my fight when I accepted your hospitality last night." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've tracked men like Blackwell before. They take what they want and leave nothing behind. No witnesses, no complications." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. "We have perhaps 20 minutes before they arrive," Mason continued. "Let's use them wisely." What followed was a flurry of purposeful activity as they prepared the cabin for defense. Mason repositioned furniture to create coverage zones, identified the best firing angles from each window, and distributed ammunition for quick access. Sarah worked alongside him with grim efficiency, her earlier wariness of him replaced by the necessity of their alliance. "You've done this before," she observed as he reinforced a shutter with a spare board. "Army scout during the war," Mason replied. "Learned to fortify positions with whatever was available." He glanced at her. "You handle that rifle like you know how to use it." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Thomas believed every frontier woman should know how to shoot, said it was as essential as knowing how to bake bread out here." He wasn't wrong. As they worked, Mason learned more about the Mitchell family through Sarah's brief explanations. Thomas had brought them west from Pennsylvania 4 years ago, drawn by stories of free land and boundless opportunity. He'd been a carpenter by trade, with dreams of building not just a homestead, but eventually a sawmill along Timber Creek. Those dreams had died with him 2 winters ago when fever swept through the territory. "The boys barely remember life before Montana," Sarah said, as she placed extra blankets near the fireplace. "Ethan has Thomas's thoughtfulness, Noah his adventurous spirit." Mason recognized the mixture of pride and wistfulness in her voice. "The sound of someone holding tight to memories while facing an uncertain future. They're fortunate to have you," he said simply. Their preparations complete, Mason returned to the window. The riders had descended from the ridge and were now making their way across the open field that separated the cabin from the western tree line. They moved in a practiced formation, maintaining distance between each man, not bunched together like casual travelers would be. "They're approaching deliberately," Mason observed, "spread out to cover multiple angles of the cabin." Sarah joined him at the window, her face pale but composed. "What do they want?" "Everything," Mason answered truthfully. "Supplies, valuables, the homestead itself. Winters when desperate men make desperate choices." He didn't voice his certainty that their intentions toward Sarah would be far worse than simple theft. The lead rider, a tall man with a dark beard, visible even at this distance, raised his hand to halt the group about 100 yards from the cabin. They conferred briefly before continuing their approach at a slower pace. "They're assessing," Mason explained. looking for signs of how many people are here, whether we're armed, potential weaknesses. "What's our strategy?" Sarah asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. Mason considered their options. "We let them approach, act like we're unaware or unprepared. The element of surprise is one advantage we can't afford to waste." "And if they simply ask for supplies and leave?" Mason gave her a level look. "Is that what your instincts tell you will happen?" Sarah held his gaze for a long moment before shaking her head slightly. "No. Mine neither," he agreed grimly. "If it comes to shooting, aim for the center of the body. Largest target. Don't try for fancy shots. And Sarah," he added, using her first name for the first time, "if something happens to me, don't hesitate. These men won't show mercy simply because you're a woman." She nodded once, resolute. "I understand." The riders were close enough now that Mason could make out individual features. The leader was indeed bearded, with a cruel set to his mouth and a long scar running along his jawline. He wore a battered cavalry coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare of sun on snow. The men flanking him were a rougher sort, unshaven, hard-eyed, dressed in mismatched winter clothing that suggested items taken rather than purchased. "That'll be Blackwell in front," Mason murmured. "The one on the far left has a distinctive limp, veteran possibly. The others look like drifters." "How do you know so much about them?" Sarah asked without taking her eyes from the approaching group. "Tracked a gang, fitting their description last fall after they raided a supply wagon near Fort Harrison. Trail went cold in the high country. Marshall figured they'd hold up for winter." Mason's expression darkened. "Didn't expect them to venture out in these conditions." The men had reached the cleared area in front of the cabin now. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, weapons visible but not yet raised. The leader, Blackwell, nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Hello, the house," he called, his voice carrying across the snow-covered yard. "Anybody home?" Mason and Sarah exchanged a glance, communicating silently. She moved away from the window, while Mason positioned himself to remain hidden from view but able to observe. "What's your business?" Sarah called back, standing slightly to the side of the window rather than directly in front of it as Mason had instructed. Blackwell removed his hat in a mockery of politeness, revealing hair streaked with grey despite a face that suggested he wasn't much past 40. "Beg pardon for the intrusion, ma'am. My men and I have been traveling since dawn, nearly froze to death in that storm last night. Hoping you might spare some coffee and a place to warm ourselves before we continue on." The performance was convincing. A weary traveler seeking basic hospitality. But Mason noted how the other riders had subtly repositioned themselves to cover different angles of the cabin, and how their hands remained close to their weapons. "I'm afraid I can't accommodate 5 men," Sarah replied evenly. "We've barely enough supplies for my family." Blackwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the polite mask slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "That's mighty inhospitable, ma'am, considering the conditions. We've money to pay for whatever you can provide. As I said, we can't help you. There's a trading post at Miller's Creek, about 10 miles south. They'll have what you need." A tense silence followed her refusal. Mason watched as Blackwell exchanged glances with his men, some unspoken communication passing between them. The pretense of civility was evaporating rapidly. "Perhaps I should speak with the man of the house," Blackwell suggested, his tone no longer friendly. "He might be more understanding of fellow travelers in need." "My husband isn't here," Sarah answered, the lie coming smoothly. "He's gone to town for supplies and expected back with neighbors any time now." Mason silently approved of her strategy, suggesting that help was imminent might give the men pause. But Blackwell merely smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's interesting," he said, "because we've been watching this place since dawn and nobody's left. No tracks heading out, just that one set coming in yesterday. He nodded toward where Mason's partially snow-covered tracks led from the stable to the cabin. So either your husband's been gone longer than you're letting on, or you're not being entirely truthful with us, ma'am. The confrontation had reached its critical point. Mason readied his revolver, knowing the next few moments would determine whether diplomacy or violence would prevail. He caught Sarah's eye and gave a slight nod. "Be ready." "My patience is wearing thin," Blackwell continued, his hand now resting openly on his holstered pistol. "One last chance to be reasonable. Open this door, share whatever supplies you have, and we'll consider leaving you with enough to survive the week. Refuse, and we'll take everything anyway, along with payment for the inconvenience." Mason had heard enough. These men had revealed their true intentions, and every moment they continued talking was simply preparation for their attack. He stepped into view beside Sarah, his Colt pointed steadily at Blackwell. "The lady already gave you her answer," he said evenly. "I suggest you and your men move on while you still can." Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he assessed the new player in this unfolding drama. The easy confidence of the stranger standing in the window, the steady hand holding the Colt, the calm demeanor, all suggested a man familiar with confrontation. This wasn't some frightened homesteader or inexperienced townsman. "Well now," Blackwell drawled, his gaze shifting from Mason to Sarah and back again. "Seems the widow has company after all." He made no move toward his weapon, but his men tensed visibly, hands hovering near holsters. "Friend of the family, are you?" "Consider me a concerned citizen," Mason replied, his aim unwavering. "One who believes 5 armed men pressuring a woman for hospitality have intentions beyond coffee and warmth." A taut silence stretched across the snow-covered yard. The other riders exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their odds now that the cabin's occupants included an armed man who appeared unintimidated by their numbers. Blackwell broke the tension with a harsh laugh. "Concerned citizen, is it? Strange. Place to be practicing your civic duty, mister. Middle of nowhere in a blizzard's aftermath." His eyes narrowed. "Got a name, concerned citizen?" Mason Reed. Something flickered across Blackwell's face, a brief flash of recognition quickly masked. "Reed," he repeated slowly, "the tracker who works with the territorial marshal." Mason didn't confirm or deny, but the fact that Blackwell knew of him confirmed his suspicions about the man's criminal activities. "This changes the calculations somewhat," Blackwell continued, his tone conversational, though his eyes had gone cold as winter ice. "We came expecting easy pickings, a widow and her young'uns, isolated by snow, low on supplies, finding a lawman's. Impet Tracker instead complicates matters. I've complicated matters for men like you before," Mason replied evenly. "It rarely ends well for them. Take my advice. There are easier targets elsewhere." One of the riders, a squat, heavy-set man with a patchy beard, spat into the snow. "5 guns against 2, Blackwell. I don't much care who he is." "Patience, Harker," Blackwell cautioned without looking away from Mason. "Mr. Reed here has earned quite a reputation. Tracked the Delaney brothers through 2 territories last year, if rumors are true. Found them when the army couldn't." His lips curved in a humorless smile. "Though I hear they didn't surrender peacefully." Mason remained impassive, but inwardly he was processing this new information. Blackwell was better informed than the average. Frontier criminal, suggesting connections and resources beyond what was apparent. And he was playing for time, keeping them talking while his men subtly adjusted their positions around the cabin. "Last warning," Mason stated flatly. "Move on." Sarah shifted beside him, her rifle trained on the riders, her presence a steady reminder of what was at stake. Mason had encountered many brave individuals during his years on the frontier, but few had displayed the quiet courage this woman exhibited in the face of mortal threat. Blackwell seemed to reach a decision. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and 3 of his men began to slowly back their horses away from the cabin. "Perhaps you're right, Reed," he conceded, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "No need for bloodshed over a misunderstanding. We'll seek provisions elsewhere." The retreat seemed too easy, raising Mason's suspicions immediately. He watched as the riders withdrew toward the tree line, maintaining his aim on Blackwell, who lingered behind. "The widow's fortunate you happened by," Blackwell remarked, backing his horse slowly. "Makes a man wonder what might have happened otherwise." His gaze shifted to Sarah, and the malice in his eyes belied his conciliatory words. "Perhaps we'll meet again under different circumstances, ma'am." Once the riders disappeared into the trees, Mason lowered his weapon but maintained his vigilance. At the window, "They're not leaving," he stated with certainty. "They're regrouping." Sarah exhaled shakily, the rifle in her hands finally lowering. "You know that man's reputation." "By reputation only," Mason confirmed. "Never crossed paths until now, but the territorial marshal has a substantial file on him. Former officer in Mosby's Rangers during the war, specialized in raids behind Union lines, brought those same tactics west after the surrender." He glanced at her. "You did well. The lie about your husband returning with neighbors was quick thinking." "Not quick enough," Sarah replied, moving to check on the twins through a small vent in the pantry wall. They saw through it immediately. After confirming the boys were safe in their hiding place, she returned to Mason's side. "What's our next move? They outnumber us more than 2 to 1. Mason considered their options, which were admittedly limited. "They'll watch the cabin, try to determine our vulnerabilities. Blackwell's too experienced to rush in without a plan." "And when night falls?" "That's when they'll make their move," Mason confirmed. "Darkness gives them the advantage of stealth and multiple angles of approach. They'll likely try to flush us out, possibly set fire to the roof or stable." Sarah's face paled at the mention of fire, but her resolve didn't waver. "How do we prepare?" "We use the daylight hours to our advantage," Mason answered, already moving toward the back of the cabin. "First, I need to retrieve something from my saddlebags." In the attached stable, Mason quickly located his weathered leather saddlebags. From within, he withdrew several items: additional ammunition for his Colt, a bone-handled hunting knife in a well-worn sheath, and a brass spyglass that had served him faithfully through years of tracking and scouting. When he returned to the cabin, Sarah had positioned herself at the opposite window, maintaining watch over the western approach. "Any movement?" he asked, joining her. "Nothing visible," she replied, "but I can feel them watching." Mason nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The sense of being observed was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in hostile territory. "We need to create defensive positions covering each approach," he explained, extending the spyglass to scan the tree line. "And we need to prepare contingencies if they breach the cabin." For the next hour, they worked methodically to fortify their position. Mason showed Sarah how to create improvised barricades using furniture that would provide cover while still allowing clear firing lanes through windows. He identified potential entry points beyond the obvious doors and windows, the roof, the chimney, the connection to the stable, and developed countermeasures for each. "You've done this before," Sarah observed, as she helped him move a heavy dresser to block direct access from the rear door. "Too many times," Mason acknowledged, "though usually with more men and better supplies." He paused, studying her face. "You're handling this remarkably well." Sarah's smile was tinged with sadness. "Fear is a luxury out here. When Thomas died, I learned quickly that panic solves nothing." She glanced toward the pantry, where her sons remained hidden. "They need me to remain steady, so I do." Mason was struck by her simple eloquence, the frontier distilled into its essential truth. Survival required pragmatism above all else. "Tell me about Blackwell," Sarah requested as they continued their preparations. What can we expect from him? Mason considered how much to share, not wanting to frighten her unnecessarily, but recognizing that information was critical to their survival. He's methodical, Mason began, carefully checking the loads in his revolver. During the war, his unit was known for thorough reconnaissance before striking. He applies the same principles now, studies his targets, identifies weaknesses, develops specific plans rather than rushing in. That doesn't sound like a common outlaw, Sarah noted. He's not. Most frontier criminals are opportunists. Quick violence, quick theft, quick escape. Blackwell operates differently. He selects isolated targets, cuts off potential escape routes or assistance, then takes his time. Mason met her eyes directly. There are stories of homesteads where he's kept families under siege for days, wearing them down physically and mentally before making his final move. Sarah absorbed this grim information with remarkable composure. And now he knows who you are, which changes his calculation, Mason agreed. I represent a more significant threat than he anticipated, and he knows I can identify him to the territorial. Marshal, he can't afford to leave witnesses now. Through the spyglass, Mason caught a brief flash of movement along the northern ridge, sunlight reflecting off metal. They've split up, he informed Sarah, positioning themselves to observe different angles of the cabin, standard military tactic, establishing a perimeter before launching an assault. Sarah moved to check their supplies, organizing ammunition for quick access. How many rounds do we have total? 26 for your rifle, 17 for my Colt, Mason replied after a quick inventory. Not enough for a prolonged engagement. Then, we need to make each shot count, Sarah said simply. As the winter sun reached its zenith, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Mason continued to monitor the surrounding terrain through his spyglass. The riders remained hidden, but occasional glints of metal or movement among the trees confirmed their continued presence. They're being patient, he observed, waiting for conditions to favor them. Darkness, Sarah confirmed, understanding. In their strategy. Mason nodded grimly. We have perhaps 6 hours of daylight remaining. They'll wait until full dark, then make their approach. He turned to Sarah, his expression grave. Before that happens, we need to discuss contingencies for the boys. Sarah's face tightened, but she nodded. What do you suggest? The passage from their hiding place to the stable. Does it have an exit point? Yes. Thomas built a small, concealed door behind the wood box in the tack room. Mason considered this information. If the situation becomes untenable, the boys might be able to escape through that route, make their way to the nearest neighbor under cover of darkness. The pain that flashed across Sarah's face revealed her understanding of what he was suggesting. A last resort if she and Mason couldn't protect them. 5 miles through snow and sub-zero temperatures, she whispered. They're only 6 years old, Mason. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. It won't come to that. I'm simply considering all possibilities. His eyes met hers. I intend to ensure you and your boys see tomorrow, Sarah, whatever it takes. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection forged in crisis but no less genuine for its circumstances. Sarah placed her hand briefly over his, a silent acknowledgement of his promise. Whatever it takes, she echoed. Outside, the winter sun continued its arc across the sky, each passing minute bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation that would determine their fate. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Mason approached the small, concealed door built into the pantry wall. Sarah had suggested he speak with the twins, believing it might reassure them to know another adult was helping protect their home. The space Thomas Mitchell had constructed was ingeniously designed, a narrow passage between the cabin's inner and outer walls, insulated with packed straw and accessible only through the hidden door. Mason crouched at the small opening. "Ethan, Noah, it's Mr. Reed. Your mother thought you might like to know what's happening." A moment of silence followed before the door, inched open, revealing two sets of identical blue eyes peering out from the darkness. Noah was the first to speak. "Are the bad men gone?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Mason considered how to respond, balancing honesty with the need to avoid frightening them unnecessarily. "Not yet," he admitted. "They're still watching the cabin, but your mother and I have made preparations to keep everyone safe." Ethan, ever the more serious of the pair, studied Mason's face with a child's perceptive intensity. "Pa said bad men sometimes come to steal from folk who live far away from town." "Your father was right," Mason acknowledged. "But he also built this cabin to protect his family, and that's exactly what it's doing." He gestured to their hiding place. "This was very smart planning." Noah edged closer to the opening. "We have blankets and water and some jerky Ma put here. Special. And Pa's old watch so we know when it's time to come out." Mason nodded approvingly. "That's excellent preparation. You're both being very brave, and that's helping your mother more than you know." "Are you going to shoot the bad men?" Ethan asked directly, his young face solemn. Again, Mason chose his words carefully. "I'm going to do whatever is necessary to protect you, your brother, and your mother. Sometimes that means talking firmly, and sometimes," he paused, "it means more than that. But my main job is making sure those men understand this isn't a battle they want to fight." The boys exchanged looks, communicating in that silent way that twins often develop. Noah nodded slightly before turning back to Mason. "Pa would have protected us if he was here," he said with certainty. "I believe he would have," Mason agreed. "And I think he'd be very proud of how you're helping your mother by staying safe and following instructions." He glanced over his shoulder, checking that Sarah was still positioned at the window. "I need to get back to watching the tree line, but is there anything you need before I go?" Ethan hesitated before asking, "Will you tell us another story about tracking, like the one about the grizzly?" Despite the gravity of their situation, Mason found himself smiling. "Next time I see you, I promise to tell you about tracking a mountain lion through Blackfoot territory. But right now, I need you both to stay quiet and hidden, no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" Both boys nodded solemnly, and Mason gently closed the hidden door, ensuring it was secure before returning to the main room where Sarah maintained her vigilant watch. "They're holding up well," he informed her quietly. "You've raised strong boys." Sarah's expression softened momentarily. "They've had to be strong." She glanced toward the pantry. "Did they seem frightened?" "Concerned but not panicked," Mason assured her. "They understand the seriousness of the situation without being overwhelmed by it. That's remarkable for children their age." "They've seen hardship before," Sarah replied, turning her attention back to the window. "When Thomas fell ill, when we struggled through that first winter alone." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "But they've never seen their mother surrender to circumstance, and they won't today either." Mason studied her profile in the fading afternoon light, the determined set of her jaw, the steadiness of her hands on the rifle, the quiet dignity with which she faced this threat to her family. In that moment, he recognized something rare and profound in Sarah Mitchell, an unbreakable resilience born not from hardness but from love. His contemplation was interrupted by movement along the northern ridge. Through his spyglass, Mason spotted two riders changing positions, working their way closer to the cabin under cover of the trees. "They're beginning to maneuver," he informed Sarah, "still maintaining distance, but positioning themselves for better coverage of all approaches." "What are they waiting for?" Sarah asked, scanning the western tree line where she'd last seen Blackwell disappear. "Darkness, primarily," Mason explained. "But they're also studying us, our defensive positions, how frequently we check different windows, whether we appear nervous or steady." He lowered the spyglass. Blackwell's assessing whether we'll make mistakes under pressure. And will we? Mason met her gaze. Not if we maintain discipline and follow the plan we've established. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the temperature dropped precipitously. The interior of the cabin, warm throughout the day from the carefully maintained fire, began to cool as shadows lengthened. Sarah added logs to the hearth, maintaining the heat that would be crucial through the coming night. "We should eat while we can," she suggested pragmatically. "Keep up our strength." Mason nodded his agreement, though he maintained his position at the window while Sarah prepared a simple meal of cornbread and the last of the previous day's stew. They ate in shifts, one always watching while the other took quick bites. "Tell me about your work with the territorial marshal," Sarah requested as they traded positions. "How does a cavalry scout become a tracker for the law?" Mason understood she was seeking distraction from the tension of waiting, and he obliged. "After the war, I drifted west like many did. Found that the skills that kept me alive during the conflict had applications in peacetime too. Tracking lost. Travelers, hunting down stolen horses, occasionally helping the marshal find those who'd rather not be found. Is that what brought you to Blackwater, tracking someone?" Mason hesitated briefly. "Yes, reports of supplies going missing from army shipments, food, ammunition, winter gear. Marshall suspected someone in the Blackwater area might be involved." "And now you're caught in our troubles instead," Sarah observed, a note of regret in her voice. "I'm where I'm meant to be," Mason countered with quiet certainty. Their conversation fell away as the final glimmers of sunlight faded from the western sky. Darkness descended rapidly, the winter night asserting itself with oppressive totality. Inside the cabin, they extinguished all lamps except one, which they placed centrally where it would provide minimal illumination without silhouetting them against the windows. "The real waiting begins now," Mason murmured, his senses heightened. In the gathering darkness, for over an hour, they maintained their vigilance in near silence, communicating only in whispers when necessary. The night grew deeper, starlight reflecting off the snow to create a spectral landscape of shadows and pale illumination outside. Mason's years as a scout had taught him patience, the ability to remain still and alert for hours while tracking, or being tracked. He sensed Sarah possessed similar fortitude, born from different circumstances but no less formidable. The first indication of movement came shortly after moonrise, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line to the west, moving with careful deliberation across the open ground toward the cabin. Through his spyglass, Mason identified the distinctive silhouette of the man Blackwell had called Harker, the heavy-set outlaw making surprisingly quiet progress through the snow. "They're beginning to move," Mason whispered to Sarah. "One approaching from the west, using the shadows cast by the moon. He's holding something, possibly a torch or lamp." "Fire!" Sarah breathed, confirming Mason's suspicion of their strategy. "He's heading toward the stable," Mason observed, "testing whether we're watching all approaches equally." Sarah shifted her rifle toward the indicated direction. "I have a clear shot." Mason considered their options. A shot now would alert the others and potentially trigger an immediate assault from multiple directions. But allowing Harker to reach the stable with fire posed its own catastrophic risk. "Take the shot," he decided. "Aim for his left shoulder. Incapacitate without killing if possible. We want to disrupt their plan without forcing them to rush us." In retaliation, Sarah steadied the rifle against the window frame, drawing a deep breath as she aligned her sight. Her finger squeezed the trigger with measured pressure, and the rifle's report shattered the night's silence. Through his spyglass, Mason watched Harker stagger backward, dropping to one knee as his left arm hung suddenly limp. The outlaw scrambled backward toward the tree line, abandoning whatever incendiary device he had been carrying. "Good shot," Mason commended. "Clean hit to the shoulder. He's retreating but still mobile." Shouts erupted from the tree line as Blackwell's men reacted to the gunfire and their companion's injury. Mason tracked multiple movements now, shadows converging, then dispersing again as the outlaws conferred urgently. "They're reassessing," he informed Sarah. "Your shot surprised them, showed we're alert and capable." "Will they retreat?" Mason shook his head. "Not permanently. Blackwell's invested too much time and planning, but you've disrupted their initial approach, which buys us time and forces them to develop a new strategy." As if to confirm his assessment, several shots rang out from the tree line, bullets thudding into the cabin's exterior logs or whistling through the air nearby. The volleys were sporadic and poorly aimed, meant to intimidate rather than precisely target. "Suppressive fire," Mason explained calmly. "They're trying to keep our heads down while they maneuver. Stay low, but maintain your watch on the stable approach." For several minutes, the erratic gunfire continued. Mason counted shots, building a mental map of the outlaws' positions based on muzzle flashes visible in the darkness. 3 distinct firing locations to the west, 1 to the north. No sign of Blackwell himself yet. The leader was keeping himself in reserve, directing rather than engaging directly. When the firing paused, Mason detected movement to the east, the direction they had shown least attention to during daylight hours. A figure slipped from shadow to shadow, making its way toward the cabin's rear door. "Eastern approach," Mason whispered. "They're probing for weaknesses, seeing if we've left any angle undefended." Sarah immediately repositioned, covering the indicated direction with her rifle. "I see him. Hold your fire unless he makes a direct attempt on the door," Mason advised. "Let's learn their pattern before revealing all our defensive positions." The night settled into a tense rhythm of movement and countermeasure. Blackwell's men would probe from one direction, drawing their attention, then attempt a stealthier approach from another angle. Mason and Sarah worked in coordinated silence, communicating with gestures and whispers, each covering the other as they monitored different approaches to the cabin. Their discipline was rewarded with insights into the outlaws' tactics. Each man had a specific role. Harker, despite his injury, provided covering fire from the western edge. A lean, agile man Mason hadn't seen clearly before specialized in testing approaches from concealment. The man with the limp observed from elevated positions, likely providing intelligence on their defensive arrangements to Blackwell. "They're systematic," Mason observed after nearly an hour of this probing. "Military precision, just as I expected from Blackwell's background. They're mapping our response patterns, identifying which windows we watch most carefully, how quickly we react to movement." "What's their goal?" Sarah asked, rubbing her eyes briefly against the strain of constant vigilance in low light. "Information," Mason replied. "The foundation for their main assault, which will come—" He paused as a new sound reached them, the soft crunch of snow on the cabin roof. "They're above us." The muffled footsteps overhead confirmed Mason's worst fear. One of Blackwell's men had managed to scale the cabin while they focused on ground-level threats. The chimney presented the most vulnerable entry point, potentially allowing an intruder to drop directly into the main room. "The fireplace," Mason whispered urgently. "Cover it." Sarah immediately understood, moving to position herself with a clear shot at the hearth, while Mason maintained watch on the windows. The footsteps above continued, slow, deliberate movements, tracking from one end of the roof to the other. "He's searching for structural weaknesses," Mason explained softly. "The connection between roof and walls, places where the logs might have weathered." A new sound joined the footsteps, the subtle scrape of metal against wood, suggesting the intruder was using a tool to test the roof's construction. Sarah's knuckles whitened around her rifle as she maintained her aim at the chimney. "Thomas built this roof to withstand heavy snow," she whispered. 3 layers of pine shingles over crossbeams." Mason nodded, integrating this information into his assessment. That presents a challenge for them, but they'll have anticipated solid construction. Listen. The movement above had paused near the center of the roof, directly over the main room. A rhythmic tapping suggested the man was testing different points, likely seeking joists or support beams. "Cover the windows," Mason instructed, slipping toward the ladder that led to the cabin's small loft. "I'm going to create a surprise for our visitor." Without waiting for a response, Mason ascended the ladder with silent efficiency, years of scouting having taught him to move without betraying his position. The loft was primarily used for storage, crates of preserves, bags of seed for spring. Planting and Thomas Mitchell's collection of tools lined the walls. Mason quickly located what he needed, a solid iron pry bar among the tools. Approaching the section of roof where the footsteps had concentrated, he pressed his ear against the underside of the shingles, tracking the intruder's movements overhead. The man had settled on a spot and begun working more forcefully. The muted sounds of wood splintering confirmed he was attempting to create an opening large enough to access the cabin's interior. Mason positioned himself directly beneath this activity, the pry bar gripped firmly in his hand. He waited with the patient stillness of an experienced hunter until the splintering sounds indicated the intruder had compromised the outer layer of shingles. With precise timing, Mason drove the pry bar upward with all his strength, punching through the weakened section of roof. A startled cry from above confirmed he'd made contact, likely catching the would-be intruder completely by surprise. Mason didn't hesitate. He thrust the pry bar through the opening again, feeling it connect solidly. Another cry followed. Then, the scrambling sounds of someone losing their footing on the snow-covered pitch of the roof. A heavy thud outside the cabin signaled the man had fallen. Mason descended the ladder swiftly to find Sarah dividing her attention between the windows and the chimney. "One down," he informed her quietly. Fell from the roof. Through the window, Mason spotted a figure sprawled in the snow below the eastern. Eve, attempting to rise, but clearly injured from the fall. Before the man could regain his feet, a shot rang out from the cabin. Sarah had taken advantage of the clear target. The figure slumped back into the snow, clutching his leg. "Wing shot," she explained, already shifting her aim back to cover other approaches. "He won't be climbing anything for a while." Mason nodded his approval. Wounding rather than killing served their tactical purpose. Each injured man became a liability for Blackwell's group, rather than a martyr to spur more aggressive action. The response from the tree line was immediate, concentrated. Fire directed at the window where Sarah's shot had originated. Bullets splintered the wooden frame and shattered a small section of glass. Sarah dropped to the floor, crawling toward another position while Mason provided covering observation. "They're angry now," he noted. "The calculated approach is giving way to emotion. Is that good or bad for us?" Sarah asked, setting up at a different window with a fresh angle on the western approach. "Both," Mason replied grimly. "Angry men make mistakes, but they're also more willing to take risks." As if confirming his assessment, two figures broke from the tree line simultaneously, using the covering fire from their companions to sprint toward the cabin from different angles. Mason tracked the first, a tall, lanky man wielding what appeared to be a bundle of cloth wrapped around a stick. An improvised torch, not yet lit. Western approach moving fast with incendiary. Mason called quietly. "I'll take him." Mason's Colt barked twice in rapid succession. The first shot missed as the runner zigzagged, but the second caught him squarely in the thigh. The man tumbled into the snow, the unlit torch flying from his grasp. Sarah had already engaged the second attacker, a shorter, stockier figure approaching from the north. Her rifle cracked, and the man dove for cover behind the woodpile, pinned down but uninjured. "He's trapped there for now," Sarah reported, maintaining her aim on the woodpile. "Can't advance or retreat without exposing himself." Her voice called out from the darkness, Blackwell himself finally breaking his silence. "You're impressing me, Reed," he shouted, his position still concealed among the trees. "4 of my men down or pinned without a single fatal shot. That's either remarkable marksmanship or foolish restraint." Mason didn't respond, knowing Blackwell was attempting to draw attention to his location while others maneuvered. Instead, he continued scanning methodically for new threats. "The widow shoots well too," Blackwell continued. "Mitchell taught her proper, it seems. Shame about his accident." Mason noted how Sarah stiffened at these words, her rifle wavering, momentarily before steadying again. "What does he mean?" Mason asked softly. "Thomas's death wasn't from natural fever," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "He was returning from Blackwater with winter supplies. Found him on the trail with a bullet in his back. The territorial marshal called it a tragic accident, Hunter mistaking him for game." Understanding dawned in Mason's mind. "Blackwell's men?" Sarah nodded once, her eyes never leaving her firing position. "I've suspected for 2 years, but never had proof. Until now." This revelation cast their situation in an even more sinister light. Blackwell's appearance at their isolated homestead wasn't random opportunity, it was the completion of an interrupted plan. Thomas Mitchell had been eliminated, and now his widow and children were targeted to clean up loose ends and claim the valuable homestead. "Makes this personal," Mason observed quietly. "It's been personal since the day I buried my husband," Sarah replied with steely resolve. The standoff continued as minutes stretched into an hour. Occasional shots from the tree line tested their vigilance, but no further direct assaults materialized. The wounded man who had fallen from the roof had been dragged back to cover by his companions, leaving a dark trail in the snow. The second attacker remained pinned behind the woodpile, unable to retreat without exposing himself to Sarah's aim. Mason used the momentary lull to check their ammunition. 17 rounds remaining for your rifle, 9 for my Colt. We've been judicious, but eventually we'll run low." "What's Blackwell waiting for?" Sarah asked, the strain of constant vigilance evident in her voice despite her remarkable endurance. "Why not press the advantage of numbers?" "Because he's lost the initiative," Mason explained. "His original plan involved a quick, overwhelming assault against an unprepared widow. Instead, he's encountered organized resistance that has already cost him several men's effectiveness." He paused, considering. He's reassessing, looking for a new angle of attack. As if summoned by Mason's analysis, Blackwell's voice rang out again from the darkness. "I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Mitchell," he called. "There's no need for further bloodshed. I came for business, not slaughter." Sarah remained silent, her rifle unwavering. Mason moved to a position where he could observe without being easily targeted. "What business would that be, Blackwell?" he responded, deliberately drawing attention to himself rather than Sarah. "Terrorizing a widow and her children seems a poor way to conduct negotiations." A harsh laugh echoed across the snow-covered yard. "Always the righteous lawman, Reed. You've built quite a reputation with the territorial marshal. Wonder what he'd think knowing you're holed up with the widow Mitchell, quite cozy by all appearances." Mason recognized the attempt to provoke him and remained steady. "State your business or move on, Blackwell. Either way, this siege ends tonight." A long silence followed before Blackwell spoke again, his voice taking on a more businesslike tone. "Very well. Direct negotiation it is." A figure emerged partially from the tree line, remaining half concealed but visible enough to identify Blackwell himself. "I have a legitimate claim to this land, Mrs. Mitchell. Your husband signed transfer papers before his unfortunate passing." Sarah's intake of breath was sharp but controlled. "That's a lie," she called back, her voice remarkably steady. "Thomas would never sell our home. Not sell, Blackwell corrected. Settle a debt. Your husband borrowed heavily to finance his grand plans. The sawmill, the expanded homestead. When he couldn't repay, arrangements were made. He paused, letting his words sink in. I have the documentation with my belongings, properly witnessed and filed with the Territorial Land Office. Mason watched Sarah's face carefully, seeing the momentary doubt that flickered across her features. He's manipulating you, he said softly, creating uncertainty to divide us. Sarah's jaw tightened as she refocused. Thomas kept meticulous records, she replied. Every transaction, every agreement. There was no debt to you or anyone else. Convenient that men often hide financial troubles from their wives, Blackwell countered smoothly. Protecting you from worry, no doubt. Noble, but ultimately misguided. Mason recognized the skillful psychological warfare Blackwell was employing. Sowing doubt, undermining Sarah's confidence in her understanding of her own situation. It was a calculated tactic to weaken her resolve from within. And I suppose this imaginary debt justifies murdering him? Mason called out, deliberately shifting the focus. A bullet in the back for a man returning to his family. Blackwell's posture changed subtly, his partially visible form tensing. Accidents happen in rugged country, Reed, especially to men who resist reasonable business arrangements. The admission hung in the frigid air, confirming what Sarah had suspected for 2 years. Her husband's death had been no accident, but a calculated elimination. There's your answer, Mason told her quietly. Nothing he says can be trusted. Sarah nodded once, her momentary doubt replaced by renewed determination. I know, she whispered. Thomas would never have endangered our home. Blackwell, perhaps sensing his psychological strategy had failed, changed tactics again. I'm offering you a civilized resolution, Mrs. Mitchell. My documentation against whatever records you believe your husband kept. We ride to Blackwater together, present our respective cases to the territorial magistrate, and abide by legal ruling. And in the meantime, your men enter my home, destroy any contradicting evidence, and ensure the twins and I never reach Blackwater, Sarah responded with cutting clarity. I may be isolated, Blackwell, but I'm not naive. Mason allowed himself a moment of admiration for Sarah's sharp assessment. Despite the pressure of their situation, her mind remained incisive, cutting through Blackwell's deceptions with remarkable precision. Final offer, Mrs. Mitchell, Blackwell called, his voice hardening. Surrender the property now. Walk away with your children and whatever personal belongings you can carry. My men will escort you safely to the nearest town. He paused. Reed can accompany you as assurance of your safety, provided he surrenders his weapons. The silence that followed Blackwell's ultimatum stretched taut across the moonlit clearing. Mason exchanged a glance with Sarah, both recognizing the false generosity of the offer. Surrendering now meant certain death once they were away from the cabin's protection. He's desperate, Mason whispered. He knows his tactical position is weakening with each passing hour. Injured men, dwindling ammunition, and the risk of witnesses surviving to report to the territorial marshal. Sarah nodded her understanding, never taking her eyes from her firing position. What happens at dawn? Will they retreat? Unlikely, Mason assessed. Dawn would expose their positions while they're still invested in this operation. Blackwell can't afford to leave empty-handed, nor can he leave witnesses who can identify him as Thomas's killer. Then we need to change the equation before dawn, Sarah concluded with remarkable pragmatism. Mason studied her profile in the dim light. The determined set of her jaw, the steady hands that had maintained their vigilance for hours without trembling. In another life, under different circumstances, he might have had the privilege of knowing this extraordinary woman beyond the crucible of crisis that had thrown them together. Your answer, Mrs. Mitchell? Blackwell called from the darkness, impatience edging his voice. The offer expires with my next breath. Mason moved to Sarah's side. Let me respond, he suggested quietly. I have an idea. She nodded once, and, Mason positioned himself where his voice would carry clearly, without exposing himself to fire. "Blackwell," he called out, "your situation is deteriorating by the minute. 2 men wounded, 1 pinned down, and you've made 0 progress breaching this cabin." Meanwhile, young Wyatt Mitchell slipped out through a tunnel while you were focusing on the front door. This was a calculated bluff. There was no tunnel and no escape by anyone from the cabin. But Mason had observed how Blackwell's men were positioned primarily around the visible entrances, leaving potential for doubt about other exits. "The boy is already halfway to the Wilson place," Mason continued confidently. "By dawn, the Territorial Marshal will have a full report of your activities here, including your admission to Thomas Mitchell's murder." A tense silence followed this claim. Mason could almost visualize Blackwell's mental calculations, assessing whether the claim was credible, whether he'd observed all possible exits, whether the risk had just multiplied exponentially. "You're bluffing, Reed," Blackwell finally responded, though a new edge of uncertainty had entered his voice. "We've had this place surrounded since before you spotted us." "Are you certain?" Mason countered smoothly. "Certain enough to bet your neck on it? The Mitchell property covers 80 acres. Are you absolutely confident your 5 men have observed every possible route of escape throughout the night?" The doubt was a tactical weapon, as powerful as any bullet. Mason pressed his advantage. "The Territorial Marshal has been building a case against you for months, Blackwell. All he lacked was a witness to connect you to Thomas Mitchell's murder. Now he'll have 3, Sarah, myself, and young Ethan, who's safely away from your reach." Another silence. Longer this time. Mason could hear urgent whispers from the tree line as Blackwell conferred with his remaining men. The psychological pressure was building, the fear of imminent law enforcement involvement changing their risk calculations significantly. Sarah leaned close to Mason. "Ethan is still in the hiding place," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "But that was brilliantly played." Mason nodded slightly. "Creating uncertainty is as effective as creating fear. Blackwell is a calculating man. If he believes the risk has changed substantially, he'll adapt his strategy." Their attention snapped back to the tree line as Blackwell's voice rang out again, now with an undercurrent of controlled anger that betrayed the impact of Mason's psychological warfare. "An impressive attempt, Reed, but ultimately futile. No child left this property tonight. We've maintained sightlines on all approaches." "Are you willing to bet your life on that certainty?" Mason challenged. "The Territorial Marshal has a particular interest in your activities, Blackwell. The missing army supplies, the homesteads that mysteriously changed hands after their owners encountered accidents. It forms a pattern that ends with a noose." The man who remained pinned behind the woodpile suddenly shouted toward the tree. "Line, Blackwell, this is turning bad. I didn't sign on for a murder charge." "Silence, Farley." Blackwell barked, his carefully constructed control showing its first significant cracks. Mason seized on this developing fracture. "Your men are questioning the odds, Blackwell. They signed on for easy pickings, an isolated widow, quick profit, minimal risk. Instead, they've got wounded companions, a defensive position they can't breach, and the Territorial Marshal potentially riding in by dawn. How loyal do you think they'll remain when offered leniency in exchange for testimony against their leader?" Sarah had shifted position during this exchange, covering a new angle that provided better visibility of the tree line where Blackwell concealed himself. Mason recognized her tactical instinct, while he kept Blackwell distracted with psychological pressure. She was positioning for a potential shot if the outlaw leader exposed himself further. "Enough talking," Blackwell snapped, his composure cracking further. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is your final opportunity. Surrender the property now, or we burn it down around you. Your choice. Before either Mason or Sarah could respond, a new sound cut through the night, the distant but unmistakable report of a rifle from the eastern ridge, followed by the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing overhead. This shot hadn't come from Blackwell's men. It had originated from behind their position. For a moment, confusion reigned on both sides of the standoff. Then a voice called out from the eastern ridge, strong, authoritative, and entirely unexpected. "Blackwell, this is Marshal Sullivan. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." Mason and Sarah exchanged startled glances. There had been no communication with the outside world, no real messenger sent for help. Who had arrived on the ridge, and why were they claiming to be the territorial marshal? The confusion in the tree line was palpable. Urgent whispers and the sounds of men repositioning suggested Blackwell's group was assessing this new threat with considerable alarm. "It's a trick," Blackwell shouted to his men. "The marshal's in Helena, 2 days' ride from here." Another shot rang out from the ridge, this one splintering a tree trunk, inches from where Blackwell's voice had originated. A second voice called out, different from the first, but equally commanding. "We have 12 men positioned around this." "Clearing, Blackwell. Your position is compromised. Surrender now or face immediate fire." Mason moved cautiously to the eastern window, using his spyglass to scan the ridgeline. In the moonlight, he could make out several figures moving into position among the trees, at least 3, possibly more. But something about their silhouettes struck him as unusual. "What do you see?" Sarah whispered, maintaining her coverage of the tree line where Blackwell and his men were growing increasingly agitated. "Movement on the ridge," Mason replied quietly. "Multiple figures, but something's not right about them." Before he could elaborate, the chaos in Blackwell's position intensified. The man pinned behind the woodpile, Farley, suddenly broke cover, throwing down his weapon and running with his hands raised toward the eastern ridge. "Don't shoot," he shouted. "I surrender. I had no part in Mitchell's murder." Blackwell's reaction was immediate and brutal. A shot rang out from the tree line, and Farley crumpled into the snow, clutching his back. The betrayal was as efficient as it was cold-blooded, Blackwell eliminating a potential witness without hesitation. "Anyone else feeling uncertain about our arrangement?" Blackwell called to his remaining men, his voice carrying a deadly promise. Execution of Farley created a moment of shocked silence across the clearing. Then, the mysterious forces on the ridge responded with a coordinated volley, 3 shots fired in rapid succession, forcing Blackwell and his men deeper into cover. "Last warning, Blackwell," the first voice called. "Surrender now or we open fire with full force." Mason continued studying the ridge through his spyglass, something about the situation finally clicking into place. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, "I believe that's Hank Wilson on the ridge." "Hank?" Sarah's surprise was evident. "But he's just one man, elderly, lives alone." "Look how they're moving," Mason explained, passing her the spyglass. "Those aren't multiple men. They're props, hats on sticks, coats draped over branches, moved by 1 or 2 people to create the illusion of a larger force." Sarah observed, through the glass, her eyes widening in realization. An old Indian fighter's trick. Hank served on the frontier for 20 years before homesteading. "He's creating the impression of superior numbers," Mason confirmed, "and doing it brilliantly. Blackwell can't be certain how many men are actually on that ridge." The standoff had evolved dramatically with this unexpected intervention. Blackwell's position, already deteriorating, now faced pressure from an additional direction. His men's confidence, already undermined by Mason's psychological tactics, was further shaken by the appearance of what seemed to be law enforcement in force. "What's our play?" Sarah asked, her tactical thinking aligning naturally with Mason's. "We maintain pressure from our position," he replied. "Let Hank's deception continue working on their minds. The more uncertainty we create, the more likely someone else breaks ranks." As if confirming his assessment, urgent disagreement became audible from Blackwell's position. harsh whispers escalating into heated exchange. The disciplined unit was fracturing under the combined pressure of actual and perceived threats. "This is falling apart, Blackwell," one voice insisted. Mitchell never mentioned facing a posse. "Control yourself, Davis," Blackwell hissed back, his voice carrying in the still night air. "It's a bluff. The marshal can't possibly—" He was interrupted by another shot from the ridge, this one kicking up snow mere inches from the tree where Blackwell had taken cover. The precision of the shot spoke to the shooter's skill, deliberately missing, while demonstrating how easily it could have found its mark. Mason turned to Sarah, a plan forming. "Cover me! I'm going to force Blackwell's hand." Before she could object, Mason moved to the cabin door, positioning himself to the side rather than directly in front of it. "Blackwell," he called out, "your men are deserting you. Surrender now, and I'll testify that you offered to turn yourself in peacefully." This claim was designed to create the impression that men were already slipping away, potentially inspiring actual desertions among those wavering. Sarah understood immediately, shifting to provide covering fire if needed. "You're cornered, Blackwell," Mason continued. "Marshal Sullivan to the east, your wounded men unable to fight effectively, and your unwounded men questioning whether this land is worth hanging for." The pressure was building toward a breaking point. Mason could sense it, the critical moment when Blackwell would be forced to either retreat or commit to a desperate final assault. Either way, the next few minutes would determine all their fates. The breaking point came with the first pale light of dawn creeping across the eastern sky. Blackwell, recognizing his rapidly diminishing tactical advantage, made his decision. "Burn them out," he shouted to his remaining men. "Davis, circle west. Parker, cover him." The coordinated movement began immediately. Two figures breaking from the tree line, one carrying what appeared to be an oil lamp. Their desperate gambit was clear: reach the cabin with fire before the growing daylight fully exposed their positions. Mason reacted instantly. "Sarah, take the one with the lamp. I'll handle his cover." Their shots rang out simultaneously. Sarah's rifle cracked sharply, the bullet finding its mark with remarkable precision. The lamp carrier, Davis, dropped his incendiary device, which shattered on the frozen ground, flames briefly licking upward before dying in the snow. He clutched his shoulder, staggering backward. Mason's shot caught Parker in the leg, sending him sprawling face first into a snowdrift. Neither man was mortally wounded, but both were effectively removed from the fight, exactly as intended. From the ridge, Hank Wilson maintained his deception, firing strategically to create the impression of multiple shooters while shouting commands to his imaginary posse. The psychological effect was devastating to the morale of Blackwell's remaining men. "Blackwell, it's over!" Mason called out. "You've lost half your men, and Dawn's exposing the rest. The territorial marshal's men have clear shots now." The growing light revealed the desperate situation of the outlaws. 2 men wounded near the cabin, another injured from his fall off the roof, and Farley lying motionless where Blackwell had shot him. Only Blackwell himself and 1 other man remained fully effective, their position increasingly untenable as darkness no longer concealed their movements. "I'm leaving," the voice came from Blackwell's last unwounded man. "This ain't worth dying for." "Harker, you stay put," Blackwell commanded, but the authority that had once controlled his men had evaporated. To everyone's surprise, Harker stood up from behind his cover, hands raised. "Don't shoot! I surrender!" He began walking slowly toward the eastern ridge, where he believed the marshal's posse waited. Blackwell emerged partially from cover, raising his pistol toward his deserting man. "Traitor!" Sarah, who had maintained her position at the window throughout the night, saw her opportunity. Her rifle steadied on Blackwell's exposed form, her breathing calm despite the exhaustion of the long siege. She squeezed the trigger with deliberate control. The shot echoed across the clearing as Blackwell's pistol flew from his hand, blood streaming from his shattered wrist. His howl of pain and rage carried through the dawn air as he dropped to his knees, clutching his ruined hand. "That was for Thomas," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. Mason moved quickly to the door. "Cover me," he instructed Sarah. "I'm going to secure Blackwell before he recovers enough to reach his pistol." "Be careful," she cautioned. "Even wounded, he's dangerous." Mason nodded, then slipped out the door, his Colt trained on the kneeling figure of Silas Blackwell. Moving with the cautious precision of an experienced tracker, Mason approached the fallen outlaw leader, ever watchful for sudden movements or concealed weapons. Blackwell's face was contorted with pain and fury, but his eyes held something else. As Mason drew near, the cold calculation of a predator seeking one final opportunity to strike. "It's finished, Blackwell," Mason stated, keeping a prudent distance. "On your stomach, hands behind your back." "You've ruined everything, Reed," Blackwell snarled, blood dripping from his mangled wrist into the snow. "That land was to be the centerpiece of my operation, control of the entire watershed, timber rights worth a fortune." "And Thomas Mitchell stood in your way," Mason observed, his Colt unwavering. A cruel smile twisted Blackwell's features despite his pain. "Mitchell was a fool. Refused to sell, refused to be intimidated, even when I explained how unfortunate accidents could befall. A man with a young family." His eyes narrowed. "Sometimes examples must be made." "Your confession is noted," Mason replied evenly. "Now, on your stomach." Blackwell made no move to comply. Instead, his uninjured hand inched slowly toward his boot top. "You think this ends? With me, there are others, men with money and influence. The territorial justice system bends to their will. I'll be free within—" His words cut off as Sarah's voice rang out from the cabin door, her rifle trained steadily on him. "Touch that boot knife and I'll put the next bullet through your skull, Blackwell." The deadly certainty in her voice froze Blackwell momentarily. Mason seized the opportunity, stepping forward swiftly to kick the outlaw's legs out from under him, sending him face first into the snow. With practiced efficiency, Mason secured Blackwell's hands behind his back, using leather straps from his belt. "Your men have abandoned you," Mason informed him as he completed the restraints. "Your operation is exposed, and contrary to your belief, the territorial justice system has been building a case against you for months. Your days of influencing officials are over." With Blackwell secured, Mason turned his attention to the other outlaws. Harker had reached the ridge and surrendered himself to Hank Wilson, whose deception had proven remarkably effective. Davis and Parker lay wounded in the snow, no longer posing any threat. The man who had fallen from the roof sat slumped against a tree, clutching his injured leg. Only Farley remained motionless where he had fallen, Blackwell's bullet having found its mark with fatal accuracy. A stark reminder of the outlaw leaders' ruthlessness. Sarah approached cautiously, her rifle still ready, but her immediate focus shifting to Mason. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes quickly scanning him for injuries. "I'm fine," he assured her. "It's over." The realization seemed to wash over Sarah gradually. The immediate danger had passed. The siege that had consumed the long winter. Night had ended with dawn's arrival. For the first time since Blackwell's men had appeared, she allowed herself a deep, shuddering breath. "The boys," she whispered, suddenly turning back toward the cabin. Together they hurried inside, where Sarah immediately went to the hidden door in the pantry wall. "Ethan, Noah, it's safe to come out now." The small door creaked open, revealing two tired but unharmed faces. The twins emerged from their hiding place, eyes wide as they took in their mother's exhausted appearance. "You did it, Ma?" Noah asked, his voice small but filled with absolute faith in his mother's abilities. Sarah knelt, gathering both boys into her arms. "We did it," she corrected, glancing up at Mason with unspoken gratitude. "Mr. Reed helped," Ethan observed solemnly, his perceptive gaze moving between the adults. "He certainly did." Sarah agreed, holding her sons close. From the doorway, a gruff voice interrupted their reunion. "Hope I ain't intruding on a family moment." They turned to find Hank Wilson's weathered face peering in, his ancient rifle cradled comfortably in arms that belied his 70 years. "Hank," Sarah greeted him with genuine warmth. "Your timing was impeccable." The old frontiersman shrugged, modestly. "Heard shots last night, figured someone might be in trouble." He nodded toward Mason. "Smart play, mister, claiming the marshal was coming. Gave my little charade some weight." "Your little charade likely saved our lives," Mason acknowledged. Creating the impression of superior numbers was brilliant. "Old tricks from old wars," Hank dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Got 3 of Blackwell's boys secured. The dead one ain't going nowhere, and I reckon the territory can sort out what's to be done with the lot of them." The practicalities of their situation began to assert themselves as the adrenaline of combat faded. The wounded outlaws required medical attention before transport to Blackwater for justice. Statements would need to be given, evidence of Blackwell's admission regarding Thomas's murder preserved for the territorial courts. Yet amid these pressing concerns, something more profound was taking shape between Mason and Sarah, a connection forged in crisis, but rooted in mutual respect and growing affection. As Hank departed to check on their prisoners, Mason found himself alone with Sarah and the twins in the cabin that had withstood the night's assault. Sunlight now streamed through the windows, illuminating the simple, sturdy home Thomas Mitchell had built for his family. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly, her practical nature already looking beyond the immediate triumph to the challenges. Ahead, Mason considered her question carefully. The assignment in Blackwater would still be waiting, his responsibilities to the territorial marshal unchanged. Yet something had shifted fundamentally within him during the long night, priorities rearranged, possibilities revealed that he had never before considered. "First, we secure Blackwell and his men for transport to Blackwater," he replied. "The territorial marshal will want to personally oversee their prosecution, especially with Blackwell's confession regarding Thomas's murder." Sarah nodded, but her eyes held a question she hadn't voiced. What of him? Would he simply continue on his way once the immediate danger had passed? As if sensing the unspoken question, Mason continued, his voice softening. "After that, I find myself reluctant to simply ride away, Sarah." Her eyes widened slightly, hope and caution warring in her expression. "Your work with the marshal is important," Mason acknowledged, "but last night made me realize something I've been avoiding for years. The endless tracking, moving from assignment to assignment. I've been running from the possibility of putting down roots, of building something permanent." He glanced around the cabin that had become a fortress under their combined defense. "Thomas built something remarkable here. Not just a homestead, but a foundation for a future. You fought to preserve it against incredible odds." Sarah studied, his face searching for the meaning behind his words. "What are you saying, Mason?" "I'm saying I'd like to help you rebuild what Blackwell tried to destroy," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "If you'll have me." The twins, who had been quietly observing this adult conversation with unusual patience, suddenly interjected. "Does that mean Mr. Reed is staying?" Noah asked hopefully. Ethan, ever the more thoughtful of the pair, looked between the adults with dawning understanding. "Like a new pa?" The directness of a child's question brought color to Sarah's cheeks, but she didn't look away from Mason's face. "That would be Mr. Reed's decision, Ethan, and a conversation for another time." Mason knelt to the boys' level, addressing them with the same seriousness he would afford adults. "What I'm saying is that I care deeply for your mother and for both of you. The thought of riding away from this cabin knowing I might never see any of you again, it's not something I'm willing to accept without at least asking if there might be a place for me here." He looked up at Sarah, whose eyes had filled with unexpected tears. "I know this isn't the proper way or the proper time, but nothing about our meeting has followed convention." He smiled slightly. "A blizzard, a siege, and now this impromptu proposal." "Proposal," Sarah whispered, the word carrying all the weight of possibility. "I'm asking if you might consider allowing me to court you properly, Sarah Mitchell," Mason clarified, "to see if what began in crisis might grow into something lasting in peace." For a moment, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the rekindled fire. Then Sarah's expression softened, the weariness of the long night giving way to something warmer, I think, she replied carefully, a smile gradually illuminating her face. "That would be acceptable, Mason Reed." The twins exchanged glances of approval, their young faces brightening at this unexpected but welcome development. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher, casting the snow-covered landscape in brilliant light. The siege had ended, but something new had begun. A future neither Mason nor Sarah could have anticipated when a blizzard brought a stranger to a widow's door. 3 months later, as spring thawed the frozen ground and new life emerged across the Montana Territory, Mason Reed and Sarah Mitchell were married in the small church in Blackwater. The twins stood proudly as their mother exchanged vows with the man who had helped save their home and hearts, and the cabin that had once been a fortress against danger became something far more valuable, the foundation of a family reborn from the ashes of loss, stronger for having weathered the storm together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.